Lieder sind Brüder der Revolution. Lieder sind ihre Begleiter.
I'm Hannah Judd.
I'm Sydney Hutchinson.
This is Playing the Archive, a podcast of Second World music.
Welcome to Playing the Archive, where archives come to life. On our first episode, we looked into the much ridiculed East German ballroom dance called the Lipsi. Today, Sydney and I are going to talk about another East German dance, the Orion, exploring how it fit into the broader framework of socialist dances in East German culture. Thanks for coming, Sydney.
Not a problem.
Let's start with the basics. What is the Orion and how did it come about? Who created it?
Okay, so this is a dance that was created in 1963 because that year there was a big workers' festival. There was actually one every year, but this year was kind of special because they had decided that they needed to create just a whole mass of new dance trends that would premiere at the festival for youth to try out. So in about the year leading up to the Workers' Festival of 1963, they had many planning meetings between composers, dance teachers, choreographers, cultural functionaries, and everybody who might have an interest in planning the upbringing of socialist youth. And they also had a call for contributions in which people all over the country could create their own dances and send them in for consideration. And then they picked the best of these to premiere at the Arbeiterfestspiele, or Workers' Festival. In terms of the Orion, it was created by the pros, and it got the full backing of the culture workers of East Germany at the time. They came up with a very robust promotional strategy for it with very precise timing in terms of when it would be released on the radio, who would record it, when they would demonstrate it on television, when they would introduce it at youth events, and all of that. So it was this idea of creating trends through a kind of teamwork in which ideally the composers and dancers were supposed to work together. The idea for it came from what they called a rhythmic sketch by René Dubiansky, who we already know because he created the Lipsi. But he did not write the music for Orion. The music was the creation of a different composer, Gerhard Honig, whose wife was also a lyricist, Ursula Uppmeyer, and she, of course, wrote the lyrics for it. The kind of funny thing about the Orion, though, as compared to these other dances, is that there were then two competing choreographies for it. One was come up with a pair of dancers called the Grafs, Werner and Elfriede Graf, and the other by a couple in Berlin, a couple of dance teachers, Karl Glückner and his wife, and they did not agree on which choreography to use. The funny thing that happened then is that Karl Glückner refused to accept that the cultural functionaries had put their weight behind the Graf's version because they thought it would be simpler for people to learn. He refused to support it, though, and he was in a little bit of a position of power because he wrote the column on dance for Melodie und Rhythmus, which was the popular music magazine. So when he introduced the Orion to the broader public in this magazine, he basically only described his version.
And we've explored the Dubiansky connection, but how else does it relate to the Lipsi?
Yeah, it's a pretty close follower on the Lipsi, in that we talked about the Lipsi as having this 6-beat rhythm, which was supposed to be 2 waltz counts stuck together, but it turns out to feel quite differently. The Orion is also a 6-count dance, so apparently they thought they were onto something with the Lipsi. They would kind of keep that idea going.
Mr. Twist und Mr. Madison träumen jede Nacht davon, denn im Café Oberon tanzt man heute den Orion.
Otherwise, it doesn't have quite as much of a Latin flavor as the Lipsi does. And the reason behind that was what was trendy in 1963 was the twist. So they were more looking for something to compete with the twist than to compete with, say, things like mambo, rumba, or calypso that were popular in the 1950s, which was the Lipsi's time.
And speaking of the twist, can you talk us through the choreography a little bit? How is the dance performed?
Sure. So as I mentioned, there's two different versions. The one that was officially promoted, it's pretty simple. You step right, cross left, step right, and then you take your left foot and tap across the right foot, then to the side and across the right foot. Then you just reverse the whole thing. So it's like a step, cross, step, tap, 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 and then you do it the other way. The idea was that it would not be a ballroom dance like the Lipsi was, because those were falling out of fashion. Instead, it would be more of a youth trend dance that you could dance individually on a crowded dance floor. You could dance it with a partner, but you didn't have to.
You compare this to maybe a square dance or a line dance?
It wasn't really performed in lines, I don't think. Although
Okay.
it's kind of hard to say because we don't have film footage of people dancing this in groups.
Yeah.
I don't think that was the conception, though. It would just be something like twist that you would do on a crowded dance floor, whether individually or with partners. Then there was the Gluckner version, which was a bit more twist-like, and it was also kind of more complicated to perform at the tempo that Orions are usually played, because it's sort of a little chassé step, and then a twist, 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 and then take it the other way. It's kind of fun to do, but it is a bit more athletic. So I think I could understand why they went with the Graf version.
And what other new dances were being created in the GDR at that time?
So many new dances. As I mentioned, 1963 was kind of the high point for this movement to develop new social dances. So there were dozens that came out just that year. But it was not the first. It was not the last. It was kind of somewhere in the middle of this trend of creating new dances, which more or less stretched for kind of a decade from the Lipsi into the late 60s. Although it did start a little before that, and there were periodic reappearances of this idea afterwards. I guess the first one that was aimed at creating a new social dance for young people was the Berolina. It was kind of folk dance inspired, but it came out in 1954. It was associated with this thing called the Deutschlandtreffen der Jugend, where it was supposed to be that young people from both West and East Germany could get together and have a good time. There were also periodic other attempts from the very early 50s to create new folk dances, but I put them in a different category because the intention is quite different than offering something that was supposed to be trendy and modern. So then the Lipsi was the first of these, as we talked about, and it was so successful that then they thought they might as well keep going in this direction and create more of those. So it was followed by the Pertuti. And then by a whole bunch of other ones in the early to mid-60s. Some of them were influenced by Latin American music and dance, which is what particularly interests me, like bambas, which is very much based on danzón rhythm. Or bogazo, which is more of like a tango cha-cha-cha mix. But they take influences from all of the popular dances of the time, like twist, as well as ballroom dances like foxtrot, or even blues and beat music. All these things were being remixed in an East German sort of way.
Yeah, we even see a variation on the bunny hop happen. So it's clear that there is a East-West connection that's happening at the same time as well.
Yeah, you bring up the bunny hop connection. That's kind of interesting because that came via Finland. So there were also these mediating countries, and Finland was definitely one of them because it was not a NATO country, and so it was perceived as being pretty neutral. It was fairly easy for East Germans to make connections with Finnish people or even to travel there. And so there was this dance that became very trendy in the mid-60s called the Letkis, and this was based on Finnish folk music reinterpreted for a rock band or beat format. And the choreography is basically identical to the bunny hop. And I don't know exactly why that is, but I have read the theory that it's because there were American exchange students in Finland that brought the bunny hop with them. It's just another illustration of these really international connections from which East Germany was in no way excluded. It was also a part of how music and dance trends were circulating in the 60s.
And thinking about this process of kind of trend creation and social engineering that's happening, what were the larger implications of the Orion in East German terms? How did it reflect or reinforce the political and social ideals of its time?
It's really hard to measure the impact of these things because it's so long ago that it's really, really hard to find any eyewitnesses who were there, who are still around and able to talk about it. And also, there's a lot of newspaper coverage of the premieres of these dances at the time, but it's hard to know how much to trust them because, of course, these were party organs. Of course, they were going to say that they were successful and that people loved these dances. So it's very hard to say. I can just talk about the intention, though, and that there's sort of a connection with this idea about Erziehung, or upbringing, a moral upbringing of young people. It was very important for party officials that they could use dance as a part of a good socialist Erziehung. These should teach all the moral qualities that socialist youth should have. They should be progressive. They should be optimistic at all times. So if you listen to a lot of this music back to back, a lot of it is pretty catchy and kind of fun to listen to. After a while, it gets a bit oppressive that it's all so optimistic and so cheerful all the time.
Yeah, I guess the joke about socialism maybe is that Shostakovich symphony, where in the end it's joyful, but he has that quote where he's like, somebody's beating you with a stick, saying, you must rejoice, and then I get up and say, I'm rejoicing.
Yeah, that is a bit how it is. And it kind of fits because, of course, if you're out for a fun dance evening, you're not going to be getting into real emotional or tear in your beer type of music. So it kind of fits. But in terms of music to listen to, it can be a bit much in large quantities.
And who was dancing the Orion or any of these dances? How were they received by the public? I know what you said, we have this sort of propagandist information to work with, so it's hard to totally know, but what is the sense that you have?
Yeah, I'm not too sure about how youth received them at the time. There's, of course, reports of these dances being done. As I mentioned, these are in kind of official publications, but I do believe that they were reporting on actual events that happened with their own spin on it. So I think where they were danced were at festivals like the Workers' Festival, or like there was a Baltic Sea Festival that happened in the summer, which was kind of when local East German tourists were at the seaside and they had a lot of social and dance events there. So things like that, people would be dancing them, especially because, the dance bands were a part of these organizations like the Composers Union that would be promoting these types of dances and interested in getting more people to dance them. That said, I have also talked to dance teachers who were active in the GDR at the time, and they said that they did teach these dances in their dance classes. So I think anybody who was involved in dance already, who had an interest in going to ballroom dance classes or being a dance teacher, would have learned these dances and done them at least sometimes. Another reason for that was that dance teachers were required to use a certain amount of East German music in their dance classes. So I think it was a 60-40 ratio. So if you had to play 60% East German music in your dance classes, you had only a limited amount of dance music available to you to fill that amount. And then, of course, you would be interested in trying out whatever was new.
And is there any life for this beyond our own revival efforts in post-reunification Germany, or do they just fall into obscurity?
Basically, all of them have been completely forgotten and fallen into obscurity so that nobody even remembers the names of them and are kind of shocked when I bring them up. The only exception to that is, of course, the Lipsi, which we've already talked about. However, I didn't point out in that episode that the Lipsi did have a sort of moment of revival in post-reunification Germany. There was a popular singer called Bürger Lars Dietrich, and his whole act is kind of playing up his East German identity. And so he sort of ironically re-recorded a famous Lipsi song and put out a music video with women in period attire doing Lipsi moves. And people saw this as sort of funny. But whenever they would bring it up, of course, it was mostly to make fun of it. However, there were at the time also reports of East German dancers showing up at different kind of public events and doing Lipsi dancing. So it did sort of enjoy a moment of revival, but I don't think that has really been sustained.
Yeah. And do you think sincerity is necessary? I mean, even if people are doing it ironically or to make fun of it, they're still doing it. So there is maybe a kernel there that's meaningful regardless of their motivation.
I think it's inevitable. I almost feel like you could not do them without some degree of irony today, because there is something that's just so antithetical to the way that popular music and trends work today that it's almost the only way you can approach it as a person who has grown up in the 21st century in late capitalism. So I completely understand anybody who wants to do it with a dose of irony, and I welcome them to do so, because I'd rather them dance it with irony than not dance it at all. Hannah, I wanted to ask what it was like for you to learn and dance the Orion.
So, like many musicians, I am not much of a dancer because I spent my formative time when I should have learned how to dance being the person making the music for others to dance to. Something I really like about these dances is that I find them very straightforward. I don't find it hard to learn the steps. I kind of feel like a dance master. Even compared to some other people who were dancing it with, I'm like, no, we go left now. We go right now. That feels really nice. This one was interesting because we were doing so many Alexanderplatz locations. This and Yucca were both dances where we really gathered a crowd. Different spectators came by. This is probably how people who are doing TikTok and Instagram all the time might feel. You are in a public space and you're moving around and you have a camera out, and so people are like, what is this? Are you professionals? Are you famous? Should I know you? And sometimes they will purposefully walk by, so they'll be in the background location. It's interesting to see how quickly people are entertained and intrigued, and it makes them really happy, which is also something I like.
That is cool. But basically you're saying that the dances were easy to learn, so mission accomplished. Good work, East German dance choreographers.
Thank you to the committee that made it so, because I think they really succeeded.
Awesome.
Yeah, and it's a lot of fun to do. Okay, so moving into this ironic or sincere realm, what was it like to bring this dance back to life?
It was a lot of fun. I think it's really the most fun part of the project to reconstruct the dances and try them out. As a researcher, I think it's really useful because I'm studying a historical period I don't have access to and I did not live through. And maybe the only way I can approach it is through recreating these bodily experiences for myself. I can't be there. I can't feel what it was like to live there. I can't feel what it's like to do these dances and do them to that music and see what that feels like.
Well, if you think of it, we'll fix it in post.
Yeah.
But what were the biggest challenges or surprises that you encountered during the process?
I think the Orion was pretty straightforward. Some of the other ones have been less so because there just wasn't as much information to go on. I mean, with the Orion, I really have a wealth of information at my fingertips, which I don't have for the other dances because they were so well organized in how they were going to promote this. We have a little bit of video, which is unusual. We mostly have a lot of written and photographic descriptions because, like I mentioned, it was in Melody and Rhythmus, but it was also in a lot of other publications like Weekend magazines and the television magazine, and they all publish photo sequences of the steps, which make it really easy to follow, a lot easier to follow than these footprint charts that ballroom dancers tend to use and which Gluckner also published in his. There was a lot of material to use, so that's why it was pretty straightforward. That said, there was also another dance that came out that same year, also based on an idea from Dubiansky, which was called the Chila, and it was a lot more Latin American influenced. It was based on Mexican mariachi music and Mexican son. Jaliscan son. And so the rhythms are a lot more complex. And the dance was also a lot more complex that was created for it. So at some point, because it was also in 6 and had this vaguely related Latin type of feel, at some point the officials decided that they could just combine Chila and Orion and they could be danced interchangeably. They could use the music for either one and do the steps of either one. So then I also tried to reconstruct some of the Chila steps and put them to the Orion music as they had suggested one do. And that was a bit tricky because they had created so many more steps for Chila that were more really directed at people with a dance background than Orion, which was meant for teenagers at a dance.
Yeah, definitely. So for the video, we didn't really incorporate that. We ended up using the kind of simple step method. But just to talk a little bit about the process of making the dance video, what we did first was a storyboard, right? But how did you go about picking locations, thinking about costumes and the sort of look and feel that you were going for?
Yeah, first of all, I will point out that I did use one Chila step in the final version of the video, and there was a bit more footage of that step that ended up not making it into the final cut. But at one point, you can see one of those steps. Yeah, this was the first video that we did with a storyboard, and it was really helpful in planning out the locations and kind of what steps we would do there, what section of music we would use. That was very helpful. The idea from the beginning was to film it on Alexanderplatz because it's just so iconic of East Berlin. And then also we had to draw from our own wardrobes. We did not have a wardrobe master or mistress to take care of these things for us. But delving into our own wardrobes or what one could acquire through secondhand stores, we tried to wear things that people might have been dancing in around 1963. That said, 1963 was also kind of a transitional fashion time because there were some that were going more into the miniskirt and mod look, and there were some that were still wearing the longer and more, let's say, swirly skirts of previous years.
With sort of going with a full skirt look, and it was just a combination of what people had, and also because there's twirling in the video, it's always nice to see the skirts twirl.
Yeah, exactly. When you have those turning steps that are a part of the more advanced Orion choreographies, then it's nice to have that.
And there's also a little bit of a Bob Dylan reference.
That was just my thing that I wanted to throw in. I thought it would be funny. Of course, Bob Dylan was known in East Germany, so it's not completely out of place. But it's also just so iconic, Bob Dylan with flashcards that he's tossing aside. Of course, the words on his flashcards are way more evocative than what we have in the video, which is Orion, Orion, oh. And that's also why I thought it was funny.
Orion, Orion, oh.
And what's the ultimate hope in these videos? Is it just a documentation of the project, or is there also this goal of maybe reaching participants via social media?
On the one hand, it's a document of the project, and as a researcher, I like it as an alternate publication form. I can write about dance, and I do write about dance all the time, but there's only so much you can do when you're writing about dance. At some point, you have to actually dance, and you have to be able to see what's going on with the dance. So then I like to be able to use the video format as a complementary publication method. That said, my ultimate dream would, of course, be that people watch the video and want to learn Orion themselves, and then will go on and make their own Orion videos. What would be fantastic is if somebody would create the Orion challenge and it would go viral. And of course, these are the type of dreams that an ethnomusicologist has that are unlikely to come true, but I can dream.
You never know. It worked out for Stephen Feld.
There you go. But he wasn't trying to revive a socialist social dance from East Germany. I feel like I might have more of an uphill battle.
If we call Mickey Hart, he'll also just step in.
That's true. Mickey Hart, if you're listening, give me a call.
So the Orion was one of the dances that you presented at the Long Night of Research, speaking again about this public component of the project and engaging with different audiences. How did that go? What were the workshop participant reactions like?
Yeah, this was so fun because, first of all, I had no idea who would show up to such a workshop. If you say you're going to teach socialist social dances, who's going to come? And for another, I didn't know how people would react because historically in post-reunification Germany, there's a lot of resistance to discussing East German topics, at least in certain circles. So I didn't know what would happen. And then I was pleasantly surprised by, first of all, what a diverse group of people we got coming out to do the dances, including international students as well as East Germans, one of whom had even taken classes with the Gluckners who created the chant, and also young punk people, and having all these people dancing next to each other and trying to learn these moves was really fun and unanticipated. They all seemed to be pretty enthusiastic about doing these dances and even learning more of them. I'm so encouraged that I will do that again next year, and I hope be able to offer more workshops in other locations as well.
Awesome. What do you think the process of recreating the Orion reveals about dance as an art form and as a historical record?
As I mentioned, it can be a really useful research method, especially when you're studying some place or time that you don't otherwise have access to. It does give you some kind of embodied way of connecting with that time and place, and it's kind of a way of doing field work in the past. Yeah, dance is a bit special because it lives in time and space. It doesn't easily translate to the written page. So a lot of the sources I'm using are written sources, and trying to reconstruct what people meant by these descriptions, you just come across all of the difficulties that they must have had in trying to create those descriptions in the first place, and find a way to transmit them to people even at the time when they knew that most people weren't going to be able to see them live.
I think there's something really interesting that you still see today. Obviously, video helps us the way that dance tutorials and sort of like platforms for teaching make it maybe easier. But dance and music, you run into this problem of trying to talk about it and needing embodied practice to really understand what's happening.
That's right. I really don't think there's a good way to research dance other than by dancing. At some point, you just have to try it.
Dance lineages are very much about individual instruction and not really a different way of teaching it or learning it.
That's right. And then what do we do in the case like this where that lineage has been cut? It's been a total rupture historically, socially, culturally, and now we're trying to access this culture that no longer exists. How do we do that?
I think we gotta just dance it through our feet.
That's right.
Thank you so much, Sydney, for all of these insights. Before we wrap up, is there anything else that you want to share about the project or your experience with the Orion?
I would definitely like to say that more dancers are always welcome, and we're going to continue to create more and more dance reconstructions and dance videos as time goes past. If anybody is interested in joining in to have the experience of learning and performing East German socialist social dances, they should please drop me a line, and I'd be happy to have them come by.
Great. And please like, subscribe, check out our social media channels where you can see the videos of this dance and the other dances that we're reconstructing, as well as stay up to date on the project and any events that happen.
Thanks.
Thank you.
Playing the Archive is part of the Second World Music Project, led by Dr. Sydney Hutchinson and housed at the Institute for Musicology and Media Studies at Humboldt University, Berlin. The project is funded by the Deutsche Forschungsgemeinschaft, and the podcast is produced with the support of the Media Department of Berlin's Ethnological Museum and Museum for Asian Art. In this episode, you heard bits of the Orion im Café Oberon, performed by Martina Vogel, music by Gerhard Honig. You also heard a number of tunes played by us, the Sonic Circuit Collective. These include Per Tutti by Rolf Zimmermann, Bambas by Gerhard Kunsch, and a reprise of Im Café Oberon, which is playing right now. If you'd like to see our videos of the reconstructed dances, search for the Sonic Circuit Collective on YouTube or TikTok, or visit our website, link in the show notes. That's all for now, but not forever. Thanks for joining us.